All right, I need to explain something. I know I promised to have these over the weekend and I didn't, and so I'm recording really quick the next four chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12. Why? Because you should have read the chapters, you should have done the homework, you should have done the quizzes all by now. And so, me hashing through the lecture where you've read it, and instead of wasting your time for this test, I'm just going to run through what's most important of this, okay? And I need you to just go through it real quick with me. Um, so I'll do the same thing for 10, 11, and 12. That being said, I'm going to go ahead. Chapter 9 is just a repeat of the supply and demand typically that we did on chapters 1 through 4. However, instead of saying just you and me, aggregate means total. That means all of GDP. Every factory, every industry, every person, government, exports, imports, all of it. Same goes with supply. So that being said, we're going to talk about sticky prices. We're going to understand how the demand and supply act. Now, I'm going to tell you this. They act very similar to what we've already learned. So this is why the fast pace. You should click with what we've already talked about. All right, and then we're going to talk about it from the short run as well as the long run. All right, so if our GDP grows too slow or even falls into like a recession, what's causing it? Typically, it's caused based on the output is being too low and the unemployment rising beyond the natural rate. All right, that means that people aren't making money, and that means that if people aren't making money, they're not buying anything, and therefore we're not supplying anything. Now, John Maynard Keynes stated that if we had a way of coordinating and preventing all this, then we need to do that. And so that's what he's explaining the government's role in this. All right, and then previously, classical theories deal with the markets and prices adjust instantaneously. They react to each other. That's not what we're saying. Sometimes prices get stuck. Typically, it's because wages go high and every single employer knows that if you're making money, you should be spending money. And so if you're making more money or you ask for more money, they're like, oh, well, I gave you a raise. Wasn't that enough? And so they have become sticky until they're making more money. And so, unfortunately, when our wages get stuck for more than a year, we have problems. This is going to affect supply and demand. And then, wages typically affect cost. It's the biggest contributing factor to why we have cost in a business. All right, so in the short run, these things can be contracted. They're like, the supplier says, hey, I need X, Y, and Z. And they're like, okay, at this price. And then labor unions say, hey, I need my employees to be making X wages. That's fine. But these things don't get negotiated for a contracted amount of time as well. And so it adds to the problem. All right, so if we look at like laundromats, you go to the laundry and then you wash your clothes. They have a fixed rate for some odd reason because we're not replacing parts. We're not replacing machines. And so they can fix their amounts. This is kind of why that gets sticky prices happen. Unlike vegetables, which come and go because of weather, nature, they don't last as long. This has a tendency to change rapidly. All right. So if we have that as a premise, we know that pricing and cost can play parts in each other. We then look at aggregate total demand, everybody buying, consumers and business, government, and foreign entities, and everybody supplying. We need to look at those and how they actually are determined or have some play on them. We look at the same model we did before, that X model, that Phillips curve. And we look at studying the role government plays in how this curve is going to shift. All right? So notice that it's a downward sloping. Notice that it's got a curve in it. All right? Now, GDP typically has consumption, from you and me, consumption from investment or business, consumption from government, and then consumption from foreign entities. Exports minus imports. All right? These are our four components into aggregate demand. These are what create the demand. All right? They are affected by the wealth effect. When everybody's making money, we are going to go spend. The interest rate, when times are good and interest rates are low, people are borrowing and they're spend. The international trade effect. Now, here's the thing. When prices fall, domestic goods have a tendency to be cheaper to foreign goods. The reverse happens when we ask for wages, which pushes us to other people like China. All right, so we also have the adverse effects to wealth and the adverse effects to higher interest rates. So wealth effect is the single most one that we deal with because we like money. All right. Now, again, the shifts are left and right. To the right is going to be positive. To the left is going to be a negative shift. All right. So what's going to cause this? Typically, if we adjust our money supply, if we make our money worth less, that means that typically we can't buy as much. Or if we make it worth more, then we buy more. So if we increase the supply of money, this is going to boost people's thinking that there's actually more money out there. Now keep in mind, when you increase the money supply, it decreases the value. So when we talk about exchange rates, if we're like, say, Mexico, who has a lot of currency out there, they're not necessarily able to get as much American goods because their exchange rate to dollars is not that good in takes more pesos to the dollar. Same goes if we print money. Anybody printing money, it looks like people want it and have it and need it and are able to spend it. The value's not there though. All right? But it does increase the aggregate demand. Decreasing taxes does the same thing. People got more money in the pockets. They get spendthrifty. All right? Increasing government spending. Now, increasing government spending, if we were to do it when people aren't spending, all that does is tell the American people, hey, you know what? I got you. Hey, I got you. I know that things are going to be better. Confidence. And when the government signals out that there's confidence out there, people start spending more themselves, whether they have it or not. So these three shift the demand curve. Now the negative impact, decrease the money supply, increase taxes, decrease the government spending, has the adverse effect on it. So here's that chart. Memorize it. This is what's going to shift it left and right. So if it's a positive thing for our pocketbook, then it's going to shift it to the right. If it's a negative thing to her, and we start wanting to go, I got to save money.
Sorry, could you say that again?
No. Sorry, Siri wants to talk to you. It's going to shift everything to the left, though, if we have no confidence, if we get scared. So fear is a factor in all of this, all right? How much of it? Well, it depends. It depends on a ripple effect. And as you can see here, we might start with one, but then it's going to shift a little bit further out because I can spend now at, say, Walmart, but Walmart's employees now have money coming in, so it's supposed to trickle out to them. They get paid because, if business is booming, we have more hours to give. All right, that means more money to give into your pockets, and you're going to want to spend more too. All right, well, then you've got to spend somewhere, and so that kind of goes back out further. Depends on how much. That's the question. And that multiplier is what we look at. All right. So if we look at, say, government, and they spend $10 million on us, well, that's great. That means that $10 million was infused into our economy. It goes into the households. And if you think circular flow, it's got to go out of the households into something. We are our worst enemy. We are a circular situation. If it goes in one, it's going to come out to the other side. So let's look at the formula of how we figure out what consumers have more income, why they spend, and what they do. It's a consumption function. We typically have an automatic bill payer. You know, if you got to make sure you have the basic needs, your rent, your food, your utilities. These are automatic spending. They are automatic, already in your budget. You got to pay them. Once you got a bill, you got to pay them. Whether you have the money or not, those got to get paid. So that's our first variable, CA. The second variable, B, is in its function to the GDP. So it's kind of like a multiplying factor. And it's our marginal propensity to consume all of our income. All right, so that Y, if you think a GDP is our income, GDP, Y, they're all the same. So national income is where everybody has spent money in our economy. All right, that's where the Y comes from. All right, so what is marginal propensity? How do we figure marginal propensity to consume? Or here's the other one. What's left over is saved, right? So if you think about it, if you put everything you make has two components. I'm either saving or I'm spending, right? Well, I'm either consuming or I'm saving. You add those together, it makes one whole, right? So Y would equal 1, which would equal MPC plus MPS. All right, let me show you what I'm talking about. Use my Jamboard because I can write on it. If I, give me 1 second. If GDP equals Y, and that's all of our income, we're going to say Y divided by Y would be 1, right? All right, sorry for the markings. If 1 equals our consumption, do we have any money left over? Well, then it must be our consumption plus our savings, which in turn is C plus S, okay? It's important to understand it this way, because when we look at it this way, we then can do a series of things. So I go 1 equals MPC plus MPS. That's true. 1 minus MPC is going to equal MPS if you do your algebra right? 1 minus MPS will also equal MPC. So if you figure all this algebra out, this is all we're doing is rearranging things, subtracting, moving it around. That's all we're doing, right? Go back to our PowerPoint. All right, so if we need to figure out how much somebody actually is making that ripple go, we need to figure out one thing. So we need to understand that we've had this before, a multiplier, and all it is 1 divided by MPC. So I'm going to go back 1. It's our additional consumption divided by our additional income. So if I'm making $180,000, I can't spend more than I'm already spending. But if I get a pay raise of $20,000, I'm going to only spend a small portion of that. I'm not going to spend all of it. And then what's left over saved. Well, I need to know what additional consumption was made to the whole. That $20,000 is the denominator, but that consumption, I need to know what it is, because the two make a whole. All right? So additional savings then would be divided by additional income, just like the consumption is. So they play like whatever one does, the opposite gets. So if I'm looking at the government spending $10 million, I need to know what percentage consumption that is. All right? I'm going to go back to my Jamboard. I'm going to give you some things that I want you to memorize. All right. in percentages, if we have 100%, and I say a percentage of MPC, oops, plus a percentage of MPS, all that equals 100. You're already saying that because all we're doing is adding the zeros, okay? All right. Then what I need to know that since 1 equals MPC plus MPS, I can derive that if MPC and MPS are, if it's 90 of consumption, what's left over is 10% saved. If it's 80, oops, that's ugly, I'm sorry. 80 consumption, that's 20% saved. Now, I'm going to go ahead and give you this. You need to memorize this, and I'm going to type this out, make it a little bit more understood. 90 to 10, oops. Alright, doesn't like me. 90 10 80 20. You follow along, you can probably go 75. What's next? Should be saying 25. 70. 30. Y'all getting the picture. 60. 40. And 50-50. Pretty much go backwards from here, right? Alright. Now, keep in mind, these are percents. And to get a decimal, all you got to do is put a decimal point in front of each one. So 0.9, 0.10. All this it would be equal to 1, right? 1, 0.9, 0.1. 0.8 plus 0.2 is 1. 0.75 plus 0.25 is 1. 0.7, 0.3 is 1. And on. Alright, memorize that. Take a picture of it. We're good to go. Remember your factors of 1. Alright, so if I say that MPC is 0.6, all I have to do is take that 10 million, multiply it by 0.6, B times Y, and it's going to give me the consumption of $6 million additional. I saved $4 million though. Okay? So keep in mind the multiplier to figure out how much additional consumption of $10 million spent is only 60% of that. 0.6. That would give us $6 million additional spending. If you do the multiplier, 1 divided by 1 minus MPC, which is also 1 divided by MPS, okay, which would be 1 divided by 1 minus 0.6, which is the MPS of 1 minus 0.6 is 0.4, so 1 divided by 0.4 gives us 2.5. So I'm going to show you that on Jamboard. Alright. So if my multiplier is 1 divided by 1 minus MPC, that is also the same thing as saying 1 divided by MPS. Alright? Memorize that. You just need to understand that the sum of this substitution It's easier to understand when you simplify the information. All right? Multipliers in the real world typically are smaller than this. So the main reason is because of taxes. When you get a pay raise, that pay raise increases your tax bracket. That means that you're actually paying more taxes as a result of this. So tax decreases how much additional spending we actually have and how much of the additional income can become spending. That's why I said when you first get that first raise, you're in a new tax bracket, you're not going to spend it. It's the second raise that you get that puts you further into that tax bracket that you start spending it. All right? There's controversy, though. We typically do not see these multipliers as being that large. We see them closer to 1 instead of a smaller percentage. This is an ongoing thing that you don't have to memorize. Just know that it's eventual fact. All right, so if I'm looking at this and I say a demand shocks does not affect the long run, but supply shocks do. If I shoot through a brand new item, if it's not bought, I've wasted money. If we look at determining whether demand or supply changes causes a recession, this is that, okay, do we have a demand pull or a cost push? All right? Supply changes typically are debatable as to whether or not they drive us. And that has its own image revolving around trends. If you didn't have peer pressure to buy stuff, all of it is going to be specifically on demand and advertising. If we look at historically, recessions are caused by demand shocks. They both typically cause the same. If you have a shortage, it can cause drastic effects. If you have decreases in wages, it can cause drastic effects. All right, we need to determine the difference between our short run and our long run models. And now we're going to look at the supply side on it. Because prices are sticky in the short run, we develop two different aggregate supply curves. One is a long run and one's a short run. The long run is always vertical. Always vertical. A vertical aggregate supply curve that reflects the idea that in the long run, output is determined solely by the factors of production and technology. Resources and technology. If you remember your opportunity cost graph, what made it go beyond the potential was that we needed new resources or new technology to cut costs. These two factors affect our supply, nothing else. All right, so in the long run, what drives demand is the price level typically. If the money supply increases 5% every year, if I give you a little bit more you're going to think, oh, I got a lot of money. This will generate a 5% inflation per year. But if you take that inflation off, the only thing that's being bought additionally is the items. The money spent when you resell it back is less with value. Keep that in mind. In the short run, a relatively flat curve leans to is basically what we've always dealt with. Prices are typically sticky, and it's determined by our demand. If demand doesn't buy it, we're not selling it. Aggregate demand determines the economy's output without regard to potential output. The economy can produce more or less than potential output at any given time. A recession or an overheated economy can bust. What shifts the short run? Supply curve. Changes in cost, wages, resource prices, the state of technology and the cost to replace it. taxes, subsidies, or economic regulations. These three things, input wages, technology, and taxes, affect the supply, whether or not I'm going to have it or not, because it is either costly or it's cheap. All right. Outside disturbances supply, like sharp increases in the oil in 1970s, was a supply shock. External events that shifted the aggregate supply curve. Adverse supply shocks can cause a recession, resulting in stagflation. All right. A decrease in the output with increasing prices. When those prices get stuck, we have stagflation. Inflation drove the prices up, but then not having a real output, meaning it didn't exist to begin with, and then they don't come back down fast. We're still typically susceptible to oil. If you know, Ukraine and Russia jacked up our oil prices about 3 weeks ago, and they are slow to come down. We're less dependent, though. However, it's not enough. We can still typically be affected, but we are actually able to export now than we were in the 70s. Do we need to at this point in time? Probably not, but that's not the question. All right. We now have two views of how aggregate demand and supply determine output and prices. The long run, the short run. How do they connect? Well, if we look at long run and we look at GDP, the increased competition for workers and material will drive prices up over time. How do we get that equilibrium to shift back to where everything's balanced? Well, that depends on what we do. All right? As prices rise, supply keeps moving up. Eventually, the economy returns to potential output. There's no more excess pressure on prices to rise. The process can also work in the reverse. If output is below potential, prices then fall. All right. Keep in mind, when we talk price level, not every time are we talking actual prices. We're talking about GDP and like the level of output at prices, at the quantity number, the dollar amount. That is chapter 9. Please review this as often as you need until you get that test taken. Have a good day.